Rachel, welcome to Diaspora Food Stories. How are you?
I am doing very well, thank you. Thank you for
Um,
having me.
Absolutely, joining us from Toronto, one of my favorite cities. I truly do love Toronto. I just love how vibrant it is. I love the diverse cultures. It's just really, just truly a great city.
I agree. I'm very grateful to live in Toronto and have grown up around so much diversity. So thank you for complimenting my beautiful city.
Anytime, anytime. So definitely, like I said, I want to tell your story. And then we're going to get into Abibiman Project that you founded in November of 2020, after all of what was going on in the world, especially after the murder of George Floyd. And so let's just start by sharing a little bit about you because you are Ghanaian descent, proud
Mhm.
Ghanaian descent, born or raised, I was noting, in Rexdale,
Yes.
community of Rexdale. So tell us a little bit about who Rachel is.
So that's like a pretty loaded question. I guess I don't love talking about myself. I mostly tell people, I'm like, just look at the food, but it is
Mhm.
important to tell my story. So both my parents are from Ghana.
Okay.
So I was born and raised in Rexdale, which is like the north west part of Toronto.
Okay.
So a very diverse community. I always tell people I grew up around a lot of different people from different backgrounds, and so
Mhm.
now when like I go back and teach at schools and I see that mosaic that I was familiar with, it really warms my heart to see that diversity is really blossoming. But I often was mistaken as Jamaican because there were a lot of Jamaican people around me growing up. But I
Okay.
mean, we are all connected, so
Right.
you know.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I grew up in like raised by a single mom. I'm the youngest of three siblings,
Okay.
and as a kid, I was a really picky eater,
Oh.
and which is weird. Usually, the chef loves all the food, and so
Right, though. I know people are like, "You're a chef. You should eat anything." All of those cow's guts, and I was like, you know what? That does not mean what chef
nope.
eats.
I'm like,
That's
I
not
might
what
know
it
how to
is.
cook it, but I don't want to eat it. So, yeah, I felt bad for my mom at a certain point. So I started learning how to cook certain things so I could, 10-year-old me was like, I'm going to make my lunch every day. And I
Mhm.
was very particular about it. I'm like, I'm not eating a sandwich. I'm bringing a nice service of good food. And I think that's kind of where my love for food really started. And then it just grew from there. And here I am now.
Awesome. Now, with the diversity that was there in the home, was it traditional Ghanaian food, or does your mom mix it up? Because again, you're surrounded by all this diversity.
hmm So my mom actually lived in Italy before moving to Canada.
Okay.
So we ate a lot of Italian food growing up,
Nice.
along with the food from, our country and her childhood memories and such.
Mhm.
And then as well, like some Western foods too. So we had like quite the mix of things.
Nice.
So I was really grateful to have that diversity. But I will say there was a time when I thought I was going to specialize in Italian food because of the food I grew up eating,
Mhm.
because for some reason my cultural food didn't seem as viable as a career, but that's something I can elaborate on more down the line.
Absolutely, and that's very important. So, as you're going through and food is becoming a little bit more prominent in your life, you chose to pursue it as a career, going to culinary school. Now, by I don't know, you can do whatever you want to do when you go to culinary school, but you sort of specialize more on the pastry side, the sweet side versus the savory, although you do both.
Yes.
But where was that sweet tooth come from?
Oh, I always had the sweet tooth. I if you ask any of my childhood friends or my siblings, like I lived off of candy in a way that should not have been possible. I
Mm.
am not sure how I am not diabetic to this day. From 8 a.m., I would go to the convenience store before I'd go to school and I'd be snacking on my candy all day. And even when I started in the industry as a like working in restaurants too, sometimes you're working super long days, you don't really have time to eat.
Right.
People would know to come to me because I always had candy in my pockets.
Wow. It's almost like the woman with the candy in church, right? You just want to get
I
them.
was always ready to go. I'm like, what you want? I got sour candies, I got hard candy. Like I was always ready. I'm a little better now.
Uh-huh.
Just a little bit.
Mhm.
But yeah, I always loved like the piece of baking, but I thought that I knew that when you go to culinary school, you have to learn baking and savory too. So I was like, I'll go to culinary school, I'll have that experience, work specifically in that field. And I did that for, I think, 3 years, and then went back for pastry school.
Okay.
And even when I was in settings working more on that, more as a cook, if there was an opportunity to put a dessert on the menu or bake bread or anything like that, like it always fell on me because I feel like I just had that natural inclination to do that. And
Mhm.
so going through pastry school for me was a breeze because I was like, oh, I already know how to do all of this. And so it was very validating being like, okay, this is a good choice. And I also had some health challenges that I thought that maybe being in pastry would be a little bit more manageable,
Okay.
versus the intensity of working as a chef, just because there's a little bit of a slowdown, and the hours are a little bit more respectful.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. And so then I ended up working in a pastry shop. I worked as a pastry chef in a restaurant as well.
Nice.
And then um, the pandemic came and things took a twist, and here I am now.
Nice. So let's start to go into what you were sort of alluding to earlier. So when you're in school, we know hopefully culinary schools have gotten a little better now in terms of
Mm,
being respectful to other cultures that have contributed to world cuisines,
mhm.
world techniques, etc., right? So as you're going through school and you're seeing yourself as an African woman, a Black woman, did you see yourself in these courses, of who you are, identifying who you are as a Black woman, or was it really just Eurocentric? And then you later on sort of had that, you know what, I'm going to start to, there's something missing here. There's representation missing here. So,
So when I was in culinary school, like I would say at least for my first year, I was very naive and just going in with an open mind of being like, I'm learning things, so I'm excited, right?
mhm, mhm.
The first year is more basic, that you're just learning, simple techniques that are technically transferable to any cuisine. Um, and so even going through my first year, I was still under the impression I was going to specialize in Italian food.
Okay.
And I remember being the only Black student in my class, which is still insane to me.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say maybe there were like 8 Black students that I can think of off the top of my head in my starting year. And there was like 20 classes of like 20 students. So that's not a lot of us.
Right.
Um, and I think maybe like one Black professor in the school at the time. And so we did at a certain point learn about foods of the world, is what they called it, but it was a course that was 7 weeks. So
Okay.
you learned about 7 different cuisines, and it was like Mexican, Chinese, Indian, Japanese. Um, I can't remember what the other ones were, but like it was very much not. Oh, one of them was Italian. Like
Oh,
it was not. It was very much scratching the surface of only what is seen as marketable, ethnic
mhm.
cuisines in,
That's
the
keyword you
Western
said
landscape.
too, marketable.
Correct. And so, but even the way that we were doing it, like, because now I know in retrospect, I'm like, the way that we were making Indian food, that was offensive. The way that we were
Mhm.
making Japanese food, like that, that was not true to the nature of what those foods are. And like I'd say that looking back, I I think I had the humility then, but I truly have the humility now because in specific like ethnic foods, it takes a lot for people to ever have that confidence to say they're experts.
Mhm.
They constantly feel like they're on this journey of learning,
Mhm.
where the Eurocentric perspective is I've had this training, so I know everything.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's always something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way because I was always willing to like ask questions and go past what was on the textbook.
Right.
And so my journey through culinary school, I did my first year. And then when I thought I was going to go to Italy, that didn't happen. And I ended up in France instead, in southern France. And that was one of my first intensive restaurant experiences. And through that experience, I was absolutely miserable.
Oh,
Um, I was in a small town. I was the only Black person for miles and miles and miles and miles.
right.
Um, and I felt so detached from the food because I couldn't just get like ingredients that really spoke to me. Like getting chilies was challenging. You know, I had to get my boss to go to the next town over. Like things that I never had to, things that were taken for granted living in a place like Toronto.
Mhm.
Um, and so I started like exploring different cultural foods with the ingredients that I could get. So I started making Thai curry bases, and I
Nice.
was making like Moroccan style stews, and really just exploring identity and food together. Not my cultural identity specifically, because I couldn't get my ingredients, but something, you know,
Mhm.
and something outside of that Eurocentric lens. And so when I came back and was, you know, doing classes in school where we got a little bit more flexibility and creativity, I'm like, I'm going to make peanut soup as the special for the
Mhm.
cafe. And I'm going to make contomere, which is like a stew made from, what is the cocoyam leaves.
Okay.
And, you know, make fufu and like all of these things. I want to put my culture forward, especially in a space where culinary school, you are paying to be allowed to mess up. So if me putting out my culture out there is considered as a mess up, whatever, but I'm
Right.
still getting it out there and still having that experience. So I think after like taking a break, working and coming back, I was more open minded to the idea of not staying in this traditional box.
Okay.
But I think it wasn't until I had time sitting at home in the pandemic out of work for the first time in a long time that I really thought to myself, I've been exhausting myself telling these food stories in spaces where there's nobody who looks like me, where there's food that doesn't represent me, and I'm running myself dry for a legacy that is not mine and is not for my community.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of when I had that brain switch when I was like, I think I need to look inward and figure out how I can make a change in the world using my food and my culture.
Nice.
And that's kind of like where the kernels of thought for the Abibiman Project began.